everybody. This is James Diboe, Discovering, dedicated to original peoples as always. And we've got a special guest in from Guyana. You know, this is a brother that's dealt with the Nile Valley civilizations. He's going to speak a bit on Pan-Africanism and also tell us a bit of a history of Guyana, because I'm very interested. My great-granddad is actually from Guyana as well. So it's a pleasure to meet a fellow person. How you doing, my brother?
I'm quite okay, thank you.
Good to have you on anyway. So, you know, introduced from Professor Smalls, great professor, historian, and that. Tell me a bit about yourself anyway. So, how did it begin with your studies? You know, you're born in Guyana. You know, what was life growing up like in Guyana? You know, if you can tell us a little bit about it.
Yes, thank you very much. And hello to all the watchers and listeners on your channel, James. I welcome the opportunity to discuss these issues with you. I grew up in a village in the countryside of Guyana. It's called Queenstown Village, and it's on the Essequibo coast. It was an African community, although we did not recognize just how African we were and how valuable some of the things we were doing really is up to this day. A lot of it has been eroded, but I think it's important to be aware that although we didn't recognize that we were living quite a lot of African values, one of which is something that I think many people would relate to. People over a certain age. When I was growing up, any adult could correct me if I was doing something that was, shall we say, not accepted. Now, this is where you find the African value that every adult is a parent, in the sense that parenting wasn't the job only of the biological parents. Anybody who was available and needed to parent or to help parent a child did it. And looking back, I would believe that many communities had the same behavior pattern, and it helped to mold us. We played a lot of games, you know, inventive games. We didn't have a whole lot of shiny technological things that were bought in the store. Some people had them, but we invented things like spinners, scooters. I mean, there's a whole lot that we did. We played cricket, rounders. We swam in the trenches, the canals, and in the ocean, in the lake also. And we had very full lives, amusing ourselves growing up. There were also games that we played in the evenings, like cheer, or some people might know this as cheer assault. We went to school, of course. There was grade school, primary school in the village, and I attended that. So that was some of the highlights, I would say, of me growing up.
Well, my granddad on my mum's side, he's from Trinidad. Her father born in Guyana. Now, there's two areas that I'm aware of. A place, obviously, Georgetown, that's one, and another place called Berbice.
Berbice.
Yeah. Are you anywhere near Berbice?
No. Berbice is the easternmost county in Guyana. It's close, borders Suriname.
Ah, right, okay. Right.
It's not only the capital of the entire country, but it is found in Demerara, which is the county to the west of Berbice. I'm from Essequibo, which is 5/8 of the country, and it's further west from Demerara, and it adjoins Brazil and especially Venezuela.
Right, okay. So you have the Amazon rainforest that surrounds like Brazil, Guyana, Venezuela. Was you far from the Amazon rainforest? Does it actually border Guyana? The
Part of
Amazon,
the Amazon, sorry.
the Amazon rainforest, is Guyana part of the border of Amazon rain? One of the countries surrounding the Amazon rainforest?
Well, part of the Amazon rainforest is in Guyana.
Right,
Uh,
that's it. Yeah, yeah.
it's a contiguous forest that occupies parts of Guyana, Suriname, Brazil, Guyane Française, French Guyana, parts of Venezuela.
Yeah. Do you have many indigenous people still in Guyana? I mean, I look on the internet sometimes, but you just get bits of information where the rainforest is. Have you ever came across any indigenous peoples of Guyana? Or some
Yeah,
say that, yeah.
yes, I should say, just addressing briefly again, continuing to address the last point. I spent my first 6 years growing up plumb in the Amazon rainforest.
Wow.
Um, and
Wow.
for the rest of my life in the village, we're on the fringe of that Amazon rainforest. There are many indigenous American people, Native Americans, Amerindians are some of the names they have elected to call themselves the indigenous people now. And there are many, many thousands of people of that descent in Guyana today. Um, there's a village to the immediate west of my village, Queenstown. It's called Kapui, and it's populated by indigenous Americans,
Wow.
indigenous peoples. So from an early age, I've had quite respectful and productive interaction with indigenous peoples in Guyana. They've always been like an extension of our community. They're their own community, but we've always had good relations with
Yeah.
them. We would play cricket matches against them and the kind of thing. Some of the youngsters from that community went to school in our village school.
Interesting because, there's some people, a lot of people believe that a lot of them don't exist anymore, became extinct. So it's interesting to recognize that you've got thousands of indigenous people still there. So, like you said, you've had a great relationship with them, because sometimes we wonder, like, well, what's the relationship with Africans and the indigenous peoples, especially with the colonizer coming in. So that's why I was wondering what was the relationship with majority of the Africans and indigenous peoples.
Well, the relationship I mentioned just now isn't the only kind of relationship we've had, African people have had historically with indigenous Americans. And it's very important that you mentioned colonizers, because we could go back hundreds of years, certainly from the time of Lawrence Sturm van Gravesande, who was one of the more effective colonizers during the time when the Dutch ruled Guyana. Um, they deliberately, consciously, and systematically tried to promote hostile relationships between African Guyanese and indigenous people. And it's important for us to understand how this worked and why it worked, and why they wanted the colonizers to do that. Now, it seems obvious to us today that people who have a common enemy should come together
Yeah,
on the basis of their same interests and work to fulfill their objectives based on those interests. European colonizers understood that. Some of our people, the colonized people, didn't.
yeah,
And they were induced by many things. The proverbial 30 pieces of silver to sell out their own interests and become traitors to their own people. Now, many indigenous leaders and other indigenous people fell for the gambit of the Dutch people. So they were given gifts and so on, and inveigled to do a number of things that were against the interests of African Guyanese and against the interests of indigenous people also. One of these things was to hunt down African Guyanese who were fleeing from enslavement on the plantations. And when there were insurrections, African Guyanese resisted enslavement from the inception. It's the same with all African people.
Yeah.
Some of that resistance was often armed resistance. And sometimes it was important for people conducting armed resistance to retreat into the interior. And when this happened, many indigenous people reported on the movements, killed African Guyanese, and they would cut off a hand. And that was the proof that they had killed runaway, as our resistors were called, or at least some of them. And they would be rewarded according to the number of hands they could present. Indigenous people were also inveigled to reveal the concealed villages of resistors, African Guyanese resistors, the so-called Maroons. But these were actually communities of resistance, because these were people who didn't only move away from the plantations and develop their own villages, but their villages were based, their life was based on African culture. So this was resistance in every single way, from every direction, any way you look at it, culturally, economically, physically, in every way.
Interesting. Because I understand the indentured labor of people brought from East India, the East Indians, well, South Asia, indentured laborers. Now, when they brought the indentured laborers over from India, would this be after the time of the connection with the indigenous people and the Africans, and you've got the colonizer? So then later he's brought people from India over. What was the relationship like with the people that came from India with the Africans when they first came?
It's the same story on the
Okay.
grander scale. That relationship between Asian people, we call them in Guyana usually East Indians or Indians.
Yeah.
The relationship wasn't one-dimensional. From the inception, they were Indians who understood the objective reality, as some people would call it. They knew that it was in their interest to work with African Guyanese to service their common interests. There was agitators who said that very clearly. But there was also the way in which any two people, especially if they're different, and to the extent to which they're different, need to adjust to each other. Yeah. So we shouldn't pretend that there weren't differences of opinion and so on. And African Guyanese, immediately after the legal termination of physical enslavement, some people have mistaken that for emancipation and even freedom. And that's the terminology of our oppressors. They wanted us to believe that we were emancipated and free and that kind of thing. There's a whole lot to be said about that. But the point here is that African Guyanese developed a number of independent cooperative villages along the coast of Guyana immediately after 1838. It's called the village movement, but it was part of a much wider movement to develop a civilizational alternative to the plantation barbarism organized and maintained by Europeans. Now, Europeans use their power, political, economic, military, and so on, to try to quash that African Guyanese village movement and civilizational alternative. The important point here is that at a certain point in time, around 1870 or thereabouts, many of the Indians who had finished their contracts on the estates in horrendous conditions on the estates, akin to conditions experienced by African people during enslavement. Many of those Indian people started to migrate into villages that were occupied by African Guyanese. And they had generally very good relationships with those African Guyanese. It's not one-dimensional, as I said before. And many Indian people contributed to the development of village life.
So today, dealing with in Guyana, I'm aware, like in Trinidad, the same. A lot of the Indians run the businesses, majority of them. Now, how is the relationship now? Do people still mix, or is it like they live over here and African descendants live over here, or you live amongst each other? How do you work together, even economically, politically? What's the relationship like now?
Well, the relationship right now is still exactly to be described as multidimensional.
Okay.
All of what you said just now is true. And all of what I was saying before is also true. But the extent to which there is interaction, the business ownership, and so on, these are worrying signs, not only for African Guyanese, but for all Guyanese and all decent people. And in order to understand that, we have to step back a bit and see how the situation developed. One of the things that I must mention briefly is that there were people who felt that it was in their interest to put these two races of people and cultures at antagonism to each other. I'm speaking now about African Guyanese and Indian Guyanese, because some people thought that they could benefit, especially during the time of elections, voting. So there's a lot of racial suspicion, ignorance, and animosity. But the point that you made is an extremely important one. African Guyanese have been subjected to structural discrimination from the inception, and many people do not understand this. African Guyanese who invented the retail trade in Guyana were forced out of that retail trade deliberately by Europeans who promoted the Portuguese and Chinese through a variety of instruments to middle-class status in Guyana, and kept the great majority of African Guyanese in poverty. Part of the explanation of this is the way in which loans were not granted to African Guyanese, or if there were, they were granted at very, very stiff conditions. There are things like the licensing system that was oriented against the interests of African Guyanese and in favor of these other groups. The tax system, the collection of taxes was socialized. Everybody had to pay taxes. Most of the taxes, the people who taxes fell most heavily upon, and who paid the most taxes were African Guyanese. But the distribution of taxes was privatized. Most of it went to white people and the plantation owners. So African Guyanese were further victimized by the system of so-called education, and this includes the church, which played and still plays a very significant role in the miseducation and mental enslavement, continuing mental enslavement of African Guyanese. One of the most important or significant things done to damage African Guyanese and Africans everywhere was the outlawing of African culture, the commission of cultural genocide by European enslavers and neocolonial elements. The church played a decisive role in this. And up to this day, the church in Guyana, as elsewhere, plays no role in attempting to reconnect African Guyanese with our history and our culture. So the church is very hostile, usually, to the history and culture of African people. So it's there, illiterate and semi-literate people who call themselves pastors today rave against African culture. And this is a continuation of what enslavers were doing. So there's a number of structural ways in which African Guyanese are discriminated against. And the economic system is one of these. I said before that African Guyanese were forced out of the retail trade. The communal villages, African Guyanese brought over from Africa and continued something called the boxer box hand. Some people will know this as susu, which is an African name or partner. That was stifled. Today, African Guyanese do not have the culture, the knowledge, the know-how, for the most part, of beginning and developing businesses.
Economically.
For a variety of reasons, this has been the way, the preserve of Indian people, especially, but Portuguese and Chinese. This happened for historical reasons. But many African Guyanese have been so victimized in their own minds that they actually believe that there is something wrong with them. They're defective. They can't do business. Some people will tell you that.
That's all we have.
If you put them back in contact with their own history, not only will they know that their foreparents started business, private business, in Guyana, but they will also know that the first business people in the world were African people in Africa who developed the first communities and the first civilizations in the world.
Well, interesting you mentioned about Africa, because I've looked at, you've researched into the Nile Valley civilizations. Now, how did you get into studying about the Nile Valley? Did you connect to as like Pan-Africanism to go down that route? What you're saying before about, the history can be lost in many parts of the Caribbean or the America, wherever people were enslaved, told us we didn't have no history. And how did you connect to the Nile Valley civilizations? Like what even made you think about going in that direction to find our history there?
My engagement with the Nile Valley has been fed by many streams. Perhaps the fountainhead is what one of my grandmothers, my mother's mother, said to me when I was a boy of about 12 years old. Now, you got to realize that she was a Jordanite. She was one of those conscious African people who were trying to find Africa in the midst of the chaos, the madness, the racism, the diminution of Africa. All she had was a Bible. And she and others were trying to find Africa through the Bible in a similar way to how the Rastafari in Jamaica were doing.
That's right.
In Guyana, we call them the Jordanites, and she was a Jordanite. And she said to me one day, in our language, translation, go to school, learn all you can from the background, the white people, take in their education, but do not permit them to fool you. You are an African. And I've been conscious of that and in search of Africa since then. And you could say in search of myself. There's a degree to which that search was satisfied in a general way, but I kept on because I developed an interest in it, and for reasons that need not detain us now, one of the things I did was to become a teacher and then a lecturer in a university, specializing first in the history and politics of the Caribbean. And I always had an interest in the minds of people. And this led me into West Africa. I did courses in West Africa and eventually in the whole of Africa.
Interesting.
Now, it's logical in a certain way that you would become anybody who is interested in the world, especially the history of the world or in the history of Africa, would become interested in the Nile Valley because African people in Kemet especially, but not only in the Nile Valley, developed human culture to some of the highest extents that has been developed in the history of the world.
Yeah,
And
very
although
advanced.
it's, sorry?
Very advanced civilizations, especially like,
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
Egypt and many Kemet. Yeah.
Well, African people didn't only develop high culture, civilization, if you wish, in the Nile Valley at Kemet. There's an argument to be made for Kush or Nubia.
Yeah, Kush, Nubia. Yeah.
Yeah, but also African people were at the basis of Mesopotamian civilization.
Interesting. What do you
Oh,
call it? Sumer, ancient Sumer, and then later
yes,
Mesopotamia. Yeah, definitely
yeah.
interesting.
Also, it was African people who first lived in India, what we call India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh today, and developed civilization there.
Yeah.
Cities with flush toilets and um, common drainage and that kind of thing, central drainage. Places that are called today Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, and other sites.
Well,
There
some
are
people
African
call,
people at the bottom of civilization in China
yes,
today.
some people call them like Dravidians in it, like there's
Yeah, the Dravidians is one name that
a
is still
yeah, that's
used.
just one name. Do you have a connection with some say Kush, some say it could be in from Kemet, but there's definitely, or even the Sahara Desert one time when it was lush greenlands and then people have left to migrate different parts. So I'm aware of like the connection going, building the Indus Valley civilization.
Would you say that again, please? Question?
I was aware of the connection of Africans. Listen, because one of my mentors, he's passed away now, Dr. Renaud Rashidi. I'm not sure if you've heard of him. Now, he
I
always
knew him
spoke,
personally.
yeah, he actually spoke on people from the Kush or the definitely Nile Valley that were going towards the Indus Valley, building the Indus Valley civilization, and also Mesopotamia, Persia, the Elamites, and Shang Dynasty of China, pretty much the world.
Well, I think one of the things to understand, this is no mystery.
Yeah,
And let's start by recognizing that the Nile Valley, especially Kemet, is not the beginning of African civilization.
that's it. Yeah.
It's one of the most known flowers, but it's not the beginning. And some of us say that kind of thing. It's not true. Um, the second thing to say is that humanity was born African in Africa under a tropical sky with dark skin and peppercorn hair.
Yeah.
The first human beings were African. And it is Africans who migrated in waves from Africa to become other people after long residence and adjustments in specific geographies.
Yeah.
Any human being has African ancestors. And there are many living proofs and consequences of this. The mind of humanity is based on an African unconscious mind that all of us has. So it's important for us to recognize that when Africans left Africa, they didn't suddenly and of their own volition become other people. This was a process. And they left with the culture of Africa. So lots of commonalities among humanity began with this. And if our listeners are interested, one of the things we could do is look at the Africans who live in the Andaman Islands off the coast of India.
That's
and
right.
Once you see those people and you understand that they're some of the oldest migrants in the world, I don't think you have any other arguments. But
well,
we
funny,
could analyze. Sorry?
Funny you mentioned them. I don't know, Professor Smalls told you anything about me, but I've visited a lot of indigenous peoples through Asia, through the Pacific, through many places. Now, funny you mentioned the Andaman Islands. There's a place in Southeast Asia where you still have Black people still there, indigenous peoples. I had to go into the rainforest to meet them in Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, but they're in short numbers. But if you see them, they clearly look like an African tribe. And even though Africa is very diverse, it was a blessing to meet them because they are declining in numbers. And it's unbelievable. They've been there for like 40,000 years. And they're actually a related group to the people you just mentioned before, the Andaman Islands, when people left Africa and settled in these places. So that's interesting that you mentioned about them. And the people in the Pacific Islands as well, you know, you can clearly see they kept that phenotype, you know, they've got tight hair, Africoid features, and very spiritual people.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned spiritual because one of the ways in which we know is not only by looking at the phenotype and seeing that people are physically African, but they're also culturally African.
Yes.
And that includes language. And there's a whole lot we could speak about the way in which that culture has been maintained. And in many instances, it has been modified by time and space. But, you know, in my researches and interaction, I'll give you just one example, and that example is libation. You know, many of those people still do libation, and it's striking in the way in which they do it. So there's a lot for us to rediscover about ourselves and to reattach ourselves to ourselves in all of these different places that our ancestors have migrated to and we have remained, we have remained the same.
Well, interesting, we've remained the same. Now, I was having a discussion yesterday with someone on the Zoom, and I was speaking about, well, there's two things. One, when we hear from a Eurocentric point of view, when he speaks about people leaving Africa in the beginning, he almost makes out like it was only like one or two waves, and that was it, until we got caught into the transatlantic slave trade or the Arabs took us into slavery. But there must have been multiple waves, because if you'd had the brain capacity to do it, whether it was 90,000 years ago, you wouldn't just stay in Africa until the times of we were captured and enslaved. So it's like almost this big, massive gap of maybe over 80,000 years after we left that we just stayed in Africa. It's almost like he's trying to say the people who left became more smarter. They were like a different type of Africans. And then the ones who stayed, we didn't have the brain capacity to be able to leave again, or like you were saying about going into India, we probably went multiple and multiple times to all these different regions throughout the first
It's not a
migration after.
probability.
Yeah,
It's not a probability. It's a
yeah,
fact
it's a fact.
that there were multiple waves. People were always leaving Africa,
Yeah,
not because they wanted to leave in some conscious way and said that this place is backward or anything of the sort.
yeah,
There were many drivers and there were many attractions also.
yeah.
And people left and they left for what you might call betterment. And I think it's important for us to recognize that people went to what's now Europe, they went to Asia, they went to the Pacific.
Yeah,
People found their way in the Americas. And although we don't have very robust evidence for an African presence in the Americas, I think it's important for us to recognize both A, the probability, and two, some facts that point very
like
clearly
the
in that
Olmec,
direction.
the Olmecs in Mexico, very Africoid features.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
even so, although we could raise that and say that's probability, and some of the features there, there's also the fact of some of the figurines, the the pre-European presence, and even during the time of indigenous people, they were people who carved other people, the likenesses of other people. And there are some of those carvings are of unmistakable African people.
definitely.
And somebody living anywhere would not go about carving people and get them so accurate out of pure imagination. They
Yeah,
had to have been looking at the people whose likenesses they carved. And there are
definitely.
other bits of evidence, and we need to be very clear about that.
Most.
Uh,
Yeah, so like we were saying, very interesting, like how Eurocentrics have spoke on the migration out of Africa. Like we were saying, there would be multiple times and for multiple reasons why people would, even the back migration, I've even studied about back migrations to Africa in and out. So when people think on this border mentality, so like Africa, I don't see it in ancient times as borders. You can go freely where you want to go, at the end of the day. So interesting studying ancient history and all the different places that Africans have been. Like we were talking about ancient America before, you know, um, you were speaking about figurines, I mentioned about the Olmecs and people like Ivan van Sertima, we spoke of skeletal remains in the Virgin Islands around 1200 AD, around these times, so you also have Lucia in Brazil, where it was the oldest skeletal remains reconstructed, and he said it was a black lady, called it Lucia, named after Lucy, who was in Africa. So there's many different reasons to believe that Africans did come to the Americas, whether they sailed, well, they'd have to sail, or there would be the time when the Bering Land Bridge you could cross, or sometime people went down the Pacific coast on boats, watercrafts. So there's many different times Africans and also Austro-Melanesian types came into the Americas. So as Black people, we came into the Americas from both sides, basically.
yeah, the only addition I would make to what you just said is that it is so probable that you might think it's rather easy in the scheme of things for Africans from West Africa to sail across the Atlantic. I mean, Africa, in a way of speaking, is just next door.
Yeah,
And there are many currents, and Van Sertima showed this.
yeah,
If you launch a boat at the correct time, the current would take you from Africa to parts of the Americas, the Caribbean and South America in particular.
yeah.
So this is not as impossible as some people may have been led to believe. And secondly, it's far more probable that people sailed from West Africa to the Americas than, and by people I mean Africans,
Yeah.
than crossed the land bridge. I would have to ask at what time they crossed that land bridge and whether they were still Africans in the normal sense of that term.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would say people from Mongolia who became indigenous people of America, fine. But it's also probable that people from the Pacific got to America from that direction.
Yeah.
It's astonishing how the minds of many of us have been so formed that we think of certain things and we do not think about certain other things that are just as probable or even real. And one of the things we have to say when we talk about African people migrating to the Americas is that there were Europeans who did this before Columbus.
The
And we
Vikings.
must not think
Yeah.
that Columbus is exceptional in any way, except for the fact that his voyages led to prolonged and effective contact between the Americas and other continents in the world, especially Europe in the first generations. That's the distinction of Columbus.
And you'd even
So
wonder where Columbus and these people got their knowledge because they had the Moors, they knew about the seas and that, so they were in Spain for a very, very long time, maybe 1,000 years, so another part of Europe. So,
close to 1,000 years.
Yeah,
But I think we have to keep recognizing the history of humanity in its largest dimensions.
yeah,
And one of these is the way in which Europe was a backward, disease-ridden, strife-torn, poor, resource-starved continent, especially in the western part of Europe.
definitely.
And 600 years ago, people from that part of Europe left and began to impose themselves upon other people through the use of military violence.
Yeah,
The only comparable development they had or superior or advantage they had over other people was in military technology. And that for itself speaks a lot about them. And they violently imposed themselves upon other people all around the world. This is the beginning of colonialism. Europeans would call this the age of discovery and the age of enlightenment. But much of the discovery they did was of people who were superior to they themselves in almost every respect. And many of them wrote it down, people like Heinrich Bach and others. They said that the people in Africa that they encountered were superior to them. They didn't always use the word superior, but the way in which they described the buildings, the organized cities, and the morality of the people they met in Africa, leave no doubt that they were in awe of these people because they were superior to them.
yeah,
And it is very important for us to understand that Europeans began to denigrate African people and everything African, to pathologize Africa as a way of trying to explain their own barbarism towards African people. We are not responsible for the fact that they enslaved us. That's the greatest crime in human history.
yeah,
We are the victims of that crime. Today, many of us are refusing to be victimized by it any longer.
yeah,
But we are not the criminals. And it's important for us to understand that this negative construction of African people is not true. It's not reality. It's Europeans' attempt to explain their own barbarity. So all the arts and sciences, almost everything you think about, has been infected with that European poison.
Yeah.
I
And how our
mean,
spirituality is being affected, because
oh yeah,
this played a major role in Africa and amongst other indigenous peoples as the spirituality and imposing, Western religions on them. And this is, in some ways, this is some of the most damaging in ways of like, well, showing them the white Christ and, this is the savior, making sure that you don't have no, any type of prophets looking like yourselves. It has to look like the oppressor, like this is the master. And if you want to be saved, only the master, you're the being the sent can save you. And a lot of people, let's be honest, fell for it and are still falling for it.
yeah, well, we're in a position now
Yeah,
where we have begun the fight back at the most fundamental level, and that's the level of people's minds. And we know and could demonstrate that the religions of Europe are substantially borrowed based upon borrowed ideas and practices from Africa.
yeah,
And Europeans have continued to lie in an organized way. They have actually colonized the image of Christ.
that's it.
I mean, that's astonishing.
So
And
damaging.
much of the Bible comes from Africa.
Yeah,
We could spend a long time just pointing out the continuities, the borrowings. And fact is, some people use the word theft, and it's not misplaced because Europeans have steadfastly refused to admit that they got these things from Africa. The
yeah,
Ten Commandments, the whole idea of
exactly.
what they call religion. African people didn't have religion.
Yeah,
We have spirituality,
that's it.
something far superior to somebody telling you what you must do and making a whole lot of rules for their own benefit, control.
Yeah,
That's not Africa. And we
exactly.
were integrated. We didn't have to go to a particular building, a church, on a particular day of the week, Sunday, to
Yeah,
show how we loved God. We did that in everything we did and how we did it.
yeah.
So these are important things for us to rediscover
I
about
met
us.
it when I met the Maasai tribes in Kenya and Zanzibar, particularly Kenya, and I had great discussions about them, asking about God, to see from their perspective. And he was saying that they will pray on a mountain or towards a mountain to get closer to the Creator. You don't actually use the word God, he said Creator,
Yes.
so I can see how a sacred mountain or any type of mountain you'd be more closer to nature than a building, a man-made building. I think that's common sense as well. But some people, they'll challenge me to that, and I'll say, "Well, come on, this is nature. This is straight from the Creator."
Yeah, well, we've been so infected with European notions that sometimes we can't see something that's right in front of us. We see a
Yeah,
mountain and we pretend it's not there. Or we're so, our minds are so organized that we wouldn't see it. We think it's something else.
yeah,
And the whole thing about the creator is an important point because Europeans have got so arrogant that they think that they could conquer nature and direct nature. Now, all African people and other people in different parts of Asia and the Americas lived what we call today environmentalism. It's natural, it's part of the culture in Africa.
yeah,
Europeans went there and told us we worship rocks and all kinds of things, and
yeah,
got many of us to join with them in their destruction of nature. Look what they've brought the world to today. And they're such lying set of people that when you turn on the television and you see people in Africa talking about environmentalism, invariably it's Europeans.
Yeah.
And Africans are nowhere in the background. That's part of the colossal hoax these people have played upon us. Now, African people lived environmentalism every day because you knew you preserved the environment. You didn't take more than you needed from the environment. Our relationship to the environment was regulated by need, not by greed. So before you set out on the hunt, you had to do libation and make the solemnmost pledge to the divinities concerned that you wouldn't take more than you need. You didn't see 4 antelope and try to shoot all 10. If your family needed 1, you took 1.
Yeah. European kill for sport.
Europeans have done to
They
the
kill for
buffalo.
sport. They've also, like, if you look at like Africans, hunt because he's hungry. Europeans hunt for sport sometimes, shooting foxes and shooting this. And sometimes it can just be fun to them rather than just like, this is what I need, And
Well, I mean, let's be clear. Hunting for fun is the murder of nature,
that's right. Yeah.
and that's impossible in the African arrangement of things.
Yeah.
It's only now some Europeans are beginning to learn that lesson. But they have imposed themselves on other people, stole the land, and all kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah. All over the world.
Yeah, and there has to be a reckoning, and it's beginning to happen already. And it's for us to remember our indigenous knowledge systems,
Very
to know
important.
how we operated.
But this is,
and there's a lot we could say about this.
And when we say indigenous knowledge, this is something that, like, because I've been visiting a lot of indigenous peoples around the world, and I find that the indigenous people, wherever you go, are the most spiritual people on the planet. And the ones like, for example, you get some indigenous people who might work alongside the government, and they're trying to bring them out to come into the dominant society. Now, once they decide to leave, if something in their head tells them they will live a better life in the cities, they are just, that's the end for them. That's the beginning of the end. When they decide to stay in these rainforests and stay amongst the medicines, the herbs, raise the children, the ancestors within carry the spirit of the ancestors in those forests where they're from. And it doesn't have to be a forest, it could be a savanna, but just based on the environment that their ancestors raised them in. It's, you are a part of that land, the land is a part of you, So it is important, this, and when they're chopping all, like the Amazon rainforest, for example, they've been chopping and cutting how the Amazon rainforest has shrunk, and they're just taking stuff, illegal logging, year after year. You're going to destroy nature. I mean, you can't defeat nature, and you need to realize that you cannot defeat nature. Nature will defeat you first.
Well, much of the world is beginning to learn that lesson,
Climate
and
change
the
and
consequences are devastating. I'm speaking to you from the United States of America, and many people have not caught on to the fact or to the full consequences of the fact that nature is beginning to become more and more destructive. The hurricanes are more in number, and you have more devastating storms, stronger, bigger storms. The weather patterns are often disrupted and so on. And you don't have to be somebody with 3 brains to recognize that much of this, if not all of it, really are consequences of how we've interacted with the earth over the last so many hundreds of years under the tutelage of some Europeans. They never cared. These are perhaps underdeveloped people. All they think about is themselves, and they're very materialistic. So all they want to do is grab other people's resources. The wars in places like the West Asia today, in Africa, all of that has the origins in European colonialism and neo-colonialism. And we need to understand this. So there's a lot that's wrong with the world today that result from the dominance of Western Europeans in the world.
Yeah.
And the growth of alternatives to Western European barbarism is a natural outgrowth of the struggle against dominance and depreciation led by Western Europeans. And all around us today, the BRICS countries, de-dollarization, the increasing independence and integration of vast regions of the world that has freed themselves fully or substantially from Western European dominance these are outgrowths, natural, logical outgrowths of Western European dominance.
Some people take this back to the time of the Ice Age, during these times of how the European, his survival, his mentality in the environment that he was in, and it played a big role in, obviously, in today's colonizer, and just basically because even like before the transatlantic slave trade, because I look deep into history, I look at the time, like there was a group of people called the aliens, Indo-Europeans, that conquered India, even like about 1500 BC, and then made their spirituality into Hinduism, and then the caste system came, and then, there's other places like Sumer, they would invade places like Sumer, so all Western Asian area, and even parts of Southern Europe, you had more melanated peoples living in these places. So it seems like I was aware that they domesticated the horse. So when you domesticate the horse, it's a lot easier to move around from Eurasia. Eurasia, they call it, isn't it? We're not like just Asia. Europe and Asia is a continent in one, So it's just unbelievable, like looking at the history of barbarism, And like there's a book even called by Michael Bradley, Inheritance of the Iceman, and this is an actual European writing this. So it's not like we are Afrocentric to speak on this. This is actually a European writing on this. So he's just being truthful of the survival mode that they were in, but still gives no excuses.
Reality is reality, and the Iceman Inheritance is a significant text in terms of the attempt to explain the mentality of the Eurasian.
Yeah.
Part of that is covered in a text edited by Van Sertima and Rashidi, who you mentioned just now.
Yeah.
The African presence in early Asia.
That's the book I'm on now. I've been going through that book. I'm on page 300 now, close to it. So it's some interesting things, that book. Great work.
Well, the person who, in my knowledge, first systematize the information on that kind of behavior and, in a way, reason for the behavior in modern times is Cheikh Anta Diop with his two-cradle theory.
Amazing.
That's a very, very helpful schema and explanation of why people are how they are. But you could go back further than Cheikh Anta Diop in ancient Kemet, and one of the Peras, we call them pharaohs in this language, wrote a schema about the Asiatics how they
Yeah.
move about from place to place, and they're destructive and so on.
Mm.
So there's a lot of observations in the history of Africa about these people and their inclinations. And I would begin a conversation on this aspect of humanity with that. I think the other thing to say is that too many of us have followed Europeans or a certain kind of European thinking and invested too much in physical characteristics and too little or none at all in culture.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
And we need to be very clear that it is culture that determines our humanity, not our physical characteristics.
Yeah.
I don't mean to suggest that we shouldn't pay attention to physical characteristics and we shouldn't like ourselves, whosoever we are, white or African or whatsoever. However, it's important for us to recognize that it is the degenerate thinking of some Europeans that has raised physical characteristics to such importance that racism is now a part of humanity. It's Europeans, Western Europeans, who started the idea that if you have white skin, if you're a male, then you're superior to people who don't share those characteristics with you. And the extent to which people do not share those characteristics is the extent to which they're inferior to you. So you go from white men who are at the apex, then you have white women, then you have, you know, men and women of different colors and physical characteristics and so on. So this is racism, and this is the the um the the the, the invention of a certain section of Europeans.
Yeah.
And I think that anybody who thinks about this would see that it's unscientific. It's one of the most dangerous things that we could think about. And it prevents the growth and development of large sections of humanity. Europeans have been in Africa for the past 600 years. They claim they've been developing the continent. And by this, I mean Western Europeans. And I include white people in America, United States, Canada, and the Americas among Western Europeans and in Australians on, because that's where they originated from.
Yeah.
And too many of them still have that mentality. You know, Australia, New Zealand, the Americas could be seen as settler colonies of
Yeah.
Western Europe. And it's
Yeah.
important for us to retain that understanding.
Yeah.
So these are
Sad.
the people who invented
Yeah.
racism. And as I was saying, they've been in Africa for 600 years. When they got to Africa, they themselves said Africa was more developed than them. Look at Africa today.
And you could go back to the Greeks. They were writing about Africa. Especially like Kemet. With Homer, Herodotus. Even the Italian Roman guy Diodorus. They all wrote great things about Africa and written about Africa having a connection with ancient India and other parts of the world. So it's almost like that because they writ this in their own text, Europeans, then later on they would try to debunk people like what Herodotus says, or Homer, or Diodorus, and many other scholars. So it's like contradicting on, like they're going against their own teachers because the Greeks are the ones that taught them, Greeks, and then the Romans later spreading the knowledge out amongst Europeans, which they stole off the Africans. So, because they
I
give
think
credit
one
to the
thing,
Greeks all the time, the Romans, don't they?
yeah, some of the things to notice there is that the ancient Greeks who wrote were eyewitnesses,
That's it.
usually, to
Yeah,
what they saw. And then you had Europeans years after, in some instances, thousands of years after, in effect, saying that what those eyewitnesses from among their own countries said was wrong.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
we need to be very clear that the reason why these more recent Europeans have been denigrating or attempting to denigrate Africa is, as I said before in this conversation, in order to try to explain away their own ungodly, barbaric, uncivilized behavior towards African people. You know, enslaving African people is one of the greatest crimes in history. I noticed you called it, or part of it, the Atlantic slave trade. Well, I think that's a misleading description. The Atlantic Ocean has nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
It's a passive waterway. This was a trade organized by Europeans for the benefit of Europeans and carried on by Europeans. It's a trade in African bodies. And even the word trade is not perhaps, is misleading in this case. This is barbarity. Of course, we have to recognize that there were some Africans involved in this ungodly activity too, because that's part of the truth.
Yeah.
But this was a European operation, and they recruited some confused and greedy Africans to their side. And it's important for us to remember that, because the treachery of some African people started then. And today you still have a comprador class of Africans who are comfortable with getting their 30 pieces of silver every month from systems that exploit the vast majority of African people and impoverish the continent and inhibit or prevent development. So it's important for us to see the world for what it is.
And sometimes they try to say, oh, Africans were enslaving each other even before the Europeans came. You know, prisoners of war, you know, these are, it's not exactly like a transatlantic slave. Well, what they went through with, I couldn't even compare it. Prisoners of war, because you were able to, prisoners of war later, you know, if they do good for themselves, they can rise up, you know, and be
Look,
free.
let's be honest. One of the things that Europeans have done pretty effectively is to spread lies and distortions about African people, which is usually negative, and about themselves, which is usually to big themselves up.
Mm.
And one thing about lying is that when you tell a lie, you have to tell another lie or two to cover up that lie. Then you have to tell 4 lies to cover up those other 2 lies. Then you have to tell 10 lies to cover up those 4, and it keeps growing exponentially. And right in that European Bible, if you read it carefully, you're going to see evidence of the lies. You're going to see evidence that contradict some of the things that they want us to believe, and they have succeeded in making millions of Africans believe.
Yeah.
Let me give you one of them.
So for yourself, going back, you know,
Sorry?
all what you've studied, I'm interested also, you're in the United States now, aren't you? And to go from Guyana to United States, and what was you doing in Guyana? First of all, you were studying, what was your profession that you were studying in Guyana? Because I understand some people change, they do so many different type of course, like Sheikh Anthony Diop was a multi-genius into so many different areas, and then later history. How did it begin for you to where you are now?
I was a teacher.
Teacher, okay.
And an international athlete.
Athlete.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I was a university lecturer also in Guyana.
In Guyana.
Then I went to England. I didn't go straight from Guyana to the United States.
Okay.
I spent too long in England. You know, I studied, then I taught in universities and colleges in England. Then I came to the United States.
Okay. So, did you ever visit Liverpool when you were in England? Yeah.
Yeah. I went to the Charles Wooden School.
Okay. Yeah. Charles Wooden. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And I went to Liverpool on other occasions also.
Right. So you've been, going from Guyana to UK, going to the USA. How did you find going into America when it comes to Black studies, African studies? There must be a lot more going on than in the UK.
Yes and no.
Okay.
America is a far bigger place.
There, yeah.
And African people in America have struggled and created larger spaces to do things. But America is still fundamentally a white racist society. I'm facing a combination of treachery and racism today as I speak to you. So these things exist. I mean, in America, there are some authorities. There's, for example, a governor called DeSantis in Florida, who's effectively banned schools from teaching about African people.
In
Who
Florida,
wants,
yeah.
yeah, it happens in other parts of America too, and to different extents. But the objective is to prevent the teaching of what happened, of real history. They want people to continue teaching the racist narratives that mass murderers have invented in order to try to prevent people from understanding what really happened. So, for example, the conservative generals who conducted warfare, who undertook treachery against the federal government of the United States, they still have many statues to them, especially in the south of the United States. And some people still defend those traitors. I mean, it's astonishing in the sense that many people don't even recognize them as
Yeah.
traitors.
Yeah.
But who is somebody who rebels against the federal authority? And what happened to those people? Why are they still being celebrated today? How come this has happened? If get that story, even the most outlines, the elementary outlines of it, you're going to understand some of the things that you're seeing around you. And we
Most
must
brutalist
never
people.
forget
Yeah.
that African people have been held in mental captivity for hundreds of years. And the day enough of us regain our minds is the day that the continent of Africa will change, and therefore the day that the world will change forever.
That's right.
Africa is the richest continent in the world, but it has the poorest people. African people are the people with the longest history, but we have the shortest memories. Our memory has been taken from us, and we know next to nothing usually about ourselves and our ancestors.
That's it. Gotta know yourself. That's it.
These things, these conditions that we live are related. It's because too many of us don't know ourselves that the continent is poor and our people suffer all over the world.
It's good
It
to
doesn't matter
see.
where you go.
Well, it's good to
You're
see.
likely to suffer racism as an African person. There's
Yeah.
an anti-African racism throughout the world.
Well, what's good to see is people like yourself coming from Guyana or anywhere in the Caribbean or the United States, especially people who've had the legacy, the name change, the language stripped, the culture, heritage, but to still preserve and still continue to dig and regain your history back, which is, because any other people who went through with what we went through, I don't think they can last. The black race around the planet, the worst kind of conditioning, and we are the oldest people wherever we go on this planet. So, But I want to thank you very much anyway, Kimani and Nehusi. I really appreciate you. This is James Diboe, Discovering, dedicated to original peoples. And this has been an excellent discussion. I really appreciate you giving me that extra time. So we got about a minute left, so we'll finish off. Any message you would like to give to the listeners?
Well, the first thing I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity
Appreciate
to have
it.
this discussion with you. To listeners, even the longest journey begins with the first step, as some wise person said. And all of us, it doesn't matter what we're doing, each profession is an occasion for doing African liberation. And we've got to put our shoulders to the wheel and do what we could do. Nobody's asking you to damage yourself and your prospects. But we all must understand that it's important for us to do something for our own freedom and liberation. And one way of doing that is just developing knowledge and understanding of ourselves, of who we are, where we come from, what happened to us, and passing that on to our upcoming generations. Because it's only when you know where you're coming from that you'll understand where you are, how you fit into the world, and where you need to go and what you need to do.
That's a pleasure. Really appreciate pure wisdom. And that's what we need, as the original peoples on this planet. Hopefully times will change. Times are changing.